For over 1,000 years, it stood like a myth etched in stone, Constantinople, the queen of cities. A jewel of golden domes, towering walls, and echoing cathedrals, nestled between two continents, between two worlds. But by 1453, the glory had faded. The streets once filled with scholars and merchants now echoed with silence. The markets were bare, the palaces crumbling. Once the beating heart of the Roman world, Constantinople had become a shadow of itself, a ghost city, haunted by the weight of its own legend. The people still walked beneath mosaic ceilings and marble columns, but they walked like survivors, not citizens. Fewer than 50,000 remained in a city built for 500,000. Dust gathered in old forums. Churches stood half-empty. The mighty Theodosian walls still held strong, but beyond them, a world was changing. And within the city, there was a growing chill. Not just from the spring winds, but from something deeper. Something darker. Whispers filled the churches. Prophecies resurfaced, of an emperor dying at the walls, of a crescent rising over the city of the cross. Monks scoured ancient texts. Astrologers watched the skies. And then, it came. An eclipse. The moon bled red over Constantinople. The faithful wept. The fearful fled. The symbols of old Rome flickered in the torchlight, as if fate itself were closing the final chapter. Far to the east, in Edirne, another city hummed with energy. There, a 21-year-old Sultan, Mehmed, son of Murad, studied maps and manuscripts. He had dreams, not of conquest, but of transformation. He wasn't just planning a war. He was planning to claim a prophecy of his own. To him, Constantinople wasn't a relic. It was a throne. A prize. A beginning. And so, as the city of ghosts waited behind its walls, destiny began to march. At just 21, Mehmed too was already a ruler, but not yet the conqueror he believed he was destined to become. To his court, he was an enigma, a man of two worlds. He could recite the Quran with reverence, then switch seamlessly to quoting Aristotle. He spoke Persian, Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Turkish. He surrounded himself not only with generals, but with scholars, architects, mystics, even astrologers. Where others saw Constantinople as a fortress, Mehmed saw it as a puzzle. And he meant to solve it. To the Ottoman elite, some of whom saw him as young and impulsive, he responded not with bluster, but with vision. He spoke not of plunder, but of permanence. He did not want to sack Constantinople. He wanted to make it the heart of something greater, a new Rome, reborn under a crescent moon. But brilliance alone would not breach the walls of Theodosius, walls that had repelled every enemy for 1,000 years. And so, Mehmed turned to the unconventional. He sought minds, not just armies. In the court of Edirne, a strange visitor arrived, a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a man once employed by the Byzantines, now disgraced and desperate. Orban carried blueprints. Designs for something monstrous. A cannon unlike anything the world had ever seen, so large it would take 60 oxen to move. A weapon not forged for battle, but for breaking legends. No empire had ever dared imagine such a thing. Mehmed didn't hesitate. He gave Orban everything: gold, iron, craftsmen, and time. In return, Orban gave him a thunderclap of war, a weapon that could hurl a stone the size of a man across a city. The Sultan watched as the great cannon was cast, molten fire pouring into carved molds, metal groaning under its own weight. This was no longer war. It was science turned prophecy. A tool not just to conquer a city, but to change history itself. And so, in the east, as the ghosts of Constantinople waited, a machine was being born. One that would soon echo across the ancient walls, like the footsteps of fate itself. By early April 1453, the world began to hold its breath. From Edirne, Mehmed's army thundered westward, 80,000 strong, a tide of soldiers, sappers, engineers, and artillery. Behind them rumbled siege towers and carts of ammunition. And at the heart of this monstrous caravan, the giant cannon, Orban's creation, escorted like royalty. On the other side of the Bosphorus, Constantinople braced for the storm. The city's defenders numbered barely 7,000, a fragile mix of weary Byzantines, mercenaries, and a few hundred Genoese led by the formidable Giovanni Giustiniani, a veteran of many wars. Emperor Constantine XI commanded from the ancient Blacherny Palace, determined not to abandon the city his ancestors had once called the New Rome. But within both camps, cracks were already forming. Inside Mehmed's forces, not all were loyal. The Balkan conscripts whispered about dying for a city they'd never seen. Some of his advisors questioned the wisdom of attacking a place that had humbled emperors and caliphs alike. In Constantinople, the mood was no better. Fear gnawed at the people. Supplies were low. Morale lower. Some nobles spoke of negotiation. Others of surrender. But Constantine knew, if the city fell, there would be no mercy. And then came the whispers. Rumors of a forgotten passage, an old cistern or tunnel that ran beneath the walls. A relic of the Roman engineers, hidden by time. Some said Mehmed's spies had found it. Others claimed the Byzantines had sealed it themselves, afraid of what it might invite in. But no one moved. No one dared act. Both sides knew, in a siege, secrets could be as deadly as cannons. And so, as trenches were dug and catapults creaked into place, the city held its breath, not just fearing what came from outside the walls, but what might already be moving beneath them. By mid-April, Constantinople had survived 2 weeks of thunder and fire. Day and night, the city shook. Orban's cannon roared like a dragon awakened, blasting the same stretch of wall again and again. But the stones held. Scarred, yes. But standing. Just as they had for 1,000 years. Inside the city, hope flickered. The great chain that stretched across the Golden Horn, Constantinople's ancient maritime defense, had worked. Mehmed's fleet was locked out of the harbor. The city's northern flank remained safe. The sea, it seemed, was their salvation. But Mehmed was not done surprising the world. Where others saw water as a barrier, he saw it as an opportunity. In secret, he ordered trees felled in the hills of Galata, just across the water. Oxen were brought in. Engineers began to coat wooden planks with animal fat. The terrain was steep, muddy, impossible. Or so it seemed. Then, in the dead of night, it happened. One by one, Ottoman ships appeared over the hills, gliding silently across greased wooden tracks. Galleys and transports, hauled by sheer manpower, creaked and slid over land like phantoms. Over 40 ships, pulled over a mountain. The defenders woke to a nightmare. The Golden Horn, once calm and controlled, now churned with enemy sails. The great chain had been outflanked. From the rear. Panic spread through the city like wildfire. How had they not seen? How had they not known? It wasn't just a tactical loss. It was psychological devastation. The unthinkable had happened. The impossible had become reality. If ships could sail across mountains, what else could this young sultan make real? From his command post, Constantine XI watched the harbor turn hostile, the one place he thought secure. The city was no longer surrounded. It was encircled. And with every wave that lapped against the harbor walls, the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. Constantine XI Palaiologos was no Caesar, no Augustus. He had inherited a broken crown, ruling a sliver of an empire that once stretched across 3 continents. His palace was crumbling, his treasury nearly empty, and his allies, silent. But when the siege began, the man they called Basilius stood tall. He patrolled the walls himself, speaking to soldiers by name. He oversaw rations, addressed the people, and refused to retreat behind palace walls. Day after day, while the cannons roared and the prayers grew desperate, he remained visible, a symbol that Byzantium, though wounded, still had a soul. Inside the city, fires were being fought on every front, supplies dwindled, disease crept in, and the haunting drumbeat of Mehmed's army never ceased. Yet Constantine refused despair. He sent messenger after messenger across the sea, to Venice, to Genoa, to the papacy itself. He begged for aid, invoking God, empire, and shared Christian blood. The answers came slowly, if at all. Some promised help. Most sent prayers. But time was not on Constantine's side. Then, a final letter arrived, bearing words that chilled him more than the Ottoman cannons ever could. An alliance offer from the west, but too late. Reinforcements had been delayed, scattered by storms, tangled in politics. The ships he had counted on would never come in time. And so, the emperor stood alone, ruler of a dying world, trapped in a city surrounded by enemies, with only faith and stone left to hold the darkness at bay. Yet in that darkness, he made a choice. He would not flee. He would not surrender. If the city was to fall, it would not fall without him. Not as a prisoner. Not as a symbol of defeat. Constantine would fight not as an emperor, but as a soldier. And in doing so, he became something far older than Byzantium. He became a myth. As May wore on, the skies over Constantinople grew heavy with smoke and prophecy. The people had long whispered of signs. That the city founded by Constantine the Great would fall under another Constantine. That when the moon bled, the end would be near. And now, those whispers had become screams. The siege had reached a fever pitch. The cannon fire never stopped. The walls cracked. The harbor was lost. Every street echoed with tension, and in every church, the faithful searched for answers, in stars, in scripture, in silence. Then, on the 28th of May, the eve of the final assault, the city fell quiet. No cannon. No drums. No attacks. Just a strange stillness. A breath before the plunge. That night, by flickering candlelight, a final mass was held inside the Hagia Sophia, the cathedral that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, built by emperors, crowned with domes like heaven turned to stone. But this night was different. For the first time in history, Orthodox and Catholic Christians stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder in prayer. Old wounds forgotten. Schisms set aside. There were no debates over Rome or doctrine. Only tears. Only hymns. Only the last refuge of the human spirit. Emperor Constantine XI stood among them, not above, but within. He took communion as a man, not a monarch. Around him were priests, soldiers, children, widows, all who remained. Some believed a miracle would come. That angels would descend from heaven. That God would not allow the sacred city to fall. Others, quietly, prepared to die. Outside, in the Ottoman camp, Mehmed was preparing, too. His engineers worked by torchlight. His troops lined up in waves. The final order had been given. But inside Constantinople, beneath the great dome painted with Christ Pantocrator, the city made peace with its fate. And when the candles were extinguished that night, they weren't just lights going out. They were the final stars above a world that would never return. In the early morning of May 29, 1453, the monster roared one last time. Orban's great cannon, the one they said could shatter legends, opened its mouth to the dawn and let loose a final, thunderous scream. The walls of Constantinople, battered for weeks, cracked with a groan that sounded almost human. It wasn't just stone that trembled. It was certainty. For 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls had protected the city from Huns, Arabs, Avars, and Crusaders. 3 layers of defense. Dozens of towers. Moats and ramparts. They had defied the ages themselves. Now, at the gate of St. Romanus, a breach had opened, wide enough for men to crawl through, wide enough for fear to pour in. Inside the city, soldiers scrambled to repair what they could. Giustiniani and his Genoese rushed to the walls. Buckets of earth, makeshift reinforcements, prayers shouted over hammer blows. But it was no longer enough. Outside, the Ottoman army lined up in waves, first the expendables, then the veterans, then the elite janissaries, silent and waiting. Mehmed's final gamble had begun. But even now, something deeper stirred beneath the surface. In both camps, there were whispers of betrayal. Of bribes offered. Of gates left unlocked. Of a traitor who had shown the Ottomans a secret way in, maybe through a culvert, maybe through a forgotten door. No one could confirm it. No one would speak of it. But when the fighting began, the enemy was already inside the city. The defenders were stretched thin. Wounded. Exhausted. Giustiniani himself was gravely injured by cannon fire. Morale broke with his body. And then came the moment no one saw, but everyone would feel. The gates gave way. Not all at once. Not in glorious collapse. But in failure, in confusion, in fog, in panic. A hole torn in the myth. And through that wound, history began to bleed. The monster at the gate was no longer outside. It was inside. May 29, 1453. Just before sunrise. The call to prayer had not yet echoed across the hills. The city still slept, or tried to. But at the broken gate of St. Romanus, history was already awake. The first Ottoman troops surged into the breach like a flood loosed from a shattered dam. Behind them, the city's last defenders, exhausted, bleeding, leaderless, tried to form a line. But it was already too late. The streets filled with chaos, steel against steel, screams against silence. Arrows rained from towers. Smoke twisted through narrow alleys. Churches rang not with bells, but with shouts of panic and last rites. And somewhere in that chaos, not in a throne room, but on the front line, stood Emperor Constantine XI. No crown. No imperial robe. Just a sword and the armor of a man who had chosen to die with his city. He fought shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. Some say he was unrecognizable, just another figure in bronze and blood. Others swore they saw him raise his sword one final time. Then, in a moment no one saw, he vanished. His body was never found. Some say he died at the breach. Others claim he fled into the tunnels below, still fighting. But whatever the truth, Constantine did not surrender. He became legend. By mid-morning, the resistance had collapsed. The janissaries surged through the forum. The Genoese quarter was overrun. Flames licked the rooftops. Priests clutched relics as the churches fell. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes, whispering prayers through the wood. At the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, thousands had gathered, the faithful, the fearful, the forgotten, sheltering beneath golden mosaics, hoping for a miracle. But no miracle came. The doors were broken open. And with that final breach, 1,000 years of empire came to an end. The last Roman city had fallen. And with it, the world as it had been. By midday on May 29, 1453, the siege was over. After nearly 2 months of bombardment, exhaustion, and relentless assault, Constantinople had fallen. Its great walls, long considered impenetrable, now lay breached and silent. Fires smoldered in parts of the city, while others stood untouched, eerily preserved amid ruin. The last defenders had either fallen in battle, surrendered, or fled. The Byzantine Empire, reduced in its final years to little more than the city itself, was now gone, not in theory, but in fact. And then came the moment that would echo across history. Sultan Mehmed II entered the city. He was 21, a conqueror at the threshold of empire. But what he brought was not only vengeance, or fire, or plunder. It was vision. He did not ride through the city in rage, nor raze it to rubble. Though the initial hours saw violence, looting, and chaos, Mehmed quickly moved to assert control. He issued orders to protect key sites, quell disorder, and stabilize the population. The message was clear. This city was no longer a prize, it was a capital. When Mehmed arrived at the Hagia Sophia, he dismounted. The cathedral, the greatest in Christendom for 1,000 years, had become a place of refuge during the final hours. Now, it stood quiet. The great dome, scarred but still standing, loomed above like a suspended heaven. There was no destruction. No desecration. Mehmed ordered the building to be converted into a mosque, a symbol not of erasure, but of continuity reimagined. He preserved its structure, its name, even many of its features. The city, too, he chose to rebuild, not from scratch, but from its layers. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul, and declared the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. It would become a crossroads once more, of trade, culture, religion, and power. The fall of one world had enabled the rise of another. And though the Roman Empire had breathed its last, its legacy would ripple forward in unexpected ways. The tide of history had turned, and the world would never be the same. To some, the city's fall was the end of an age, the final collapse of Rome, the extinguishing of a Christian flame that had burned for over 1,000 years. But to others, it was something else entirely, a door opening. In the West, the impact was immediate. Europe, still fractured by feudal wars and rival kingdoms, reeled in disbelief. Constantinople had stood as a buffer, a sentinel between Christendom and the Islamic world. Now it was gone, and the Ottoman Empire stood at the gates of Europe, more unified and ambitious than ever. But the fall didn't just shake crowns. It stirred minds. As Byzantine scholars fled westward, they brought with them something extraordinary: manuscripts, language, memory. The forgotten works of Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, once safeguarded in Constantinople's libraries, found new life in the cities of Italy. The timing was no accident. The Renaissance had begun to stir, but now it accelerated. Art, science, inquiry, printing presses, navigation. And with that momentum came a deeper hunger, not just for beauty and knowledge, but for new worlds. The fall of Constantinople closed the land routes to Asia. The Silk Road was no longer secure. So Europeans turned to the sea, to ships, compasses, stars. Within a generation, Portuguese caravels were rounding Africa. In less than 50 years, Columbus would sail west, searching for a new way east. The world was being redrawn. In the east, Mehmed too solidified his vision. He repopulated the city with peoples of many faiths and backgrounds: Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Turks. He built schools, markets, mosques, and bridges. He called himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, not as a mockery, but as a claim to continuity. The Roman legacy had not been destroyed. It had been transformed. Constantinople, now Istanbul, would remain a center of power for centuries. A meeting point of continents. A symbol of both the fragility and the resilience of civilization. And so, the fall of 1453 was not a single moment, but a fracture, a ripple that still moves through us. The city that once crowned emperors now welcomed sultans. The walls that once defied the world were breached, and through that breach flowed not just armies, but ideas. And in the echoes of that final cannon blast, the modern world began to speak.